Hello! Today I'm doing a review on Writing the Breakout Novel by Donald Maass. I first heard this book recommended on the Shit No One Tells You About Writing podcast, which is my favorite podcast. So of course I had to go and get it and read it. And so today I'm going to be going through what the book covers, the pros and cons, and then who this book is for and whether you should purchase it for yourself and read it or not. So, Writing the Breakout Novel is not your typical YouTube craft book. A lot of books that I cover here are about story structure, like Save the Cat, like Anatomy of Story, like Story by Robert McKee. This is not about those. You won't find the words like plot point 2 anywhere in this book. Really, the premise of it is that this author, Donald Maass, has helped midlist writers become, breakout novelists. And so he's done analysis on that. And by breakout, we mean anything that is like an uptick in sales. So say you were an author and you're selling, about here, then we have one book and suddenly it goes, and it's really, really cool. An example, I think, would be Taylor Jenkins Reid. She had 4 books, I believe, before The 7 Husbands of Evelyn Hugo. And I would say 7 Husbands is probably her breakout novel because I have never heard of the other ones until I heard of 7 Husbands. And so that is the book that suddenly changed the pattern and gave her, a really much larger, I believe, following, a much larger fan base, much larger sales. And his premise, really, is that a breakout novel does not depend on like the market or the publisher's advertising or anything like that, which you could argue maybe not, but it really depends on the one thing you can control as an author, which is how good your book is and how original, standout-ish, compelling it is to readers. And so that is what he is conveying in this, explaining what the elements of a breakout novel are, techniques to use to realize that, and basically it covers, these are the chapters, why breakout writing is important, the premise, stakes, characters, contemporary point of view, multiple viewpoints, advanced plot structures, and theme. So here, let's get into our pros and cons. My first pro is that it gets very specific and very actionable. There's a section, for example, about making characters larger than life. In another craft book, there might be advice like amp the character up, amp up the qualities, but he doesn't do that. He says in most breakout novels, the protagonists have these 4 qualities: strength, inner conflict, self-regard, and wit and spontaneity. And I really like the extent that he talks about characters that do and do not work or show up in breakout novels versus rarely show up in breakout novels. There's not a right and a wrong in art, obviously, but it is interesting to see or to look at the patterns for what works and what doesn't. And I think I always say creativity loves constraints, and I think that this is giving you constraints to work in. He also gets into topics that I don't think are often covered or aren't covered that much. So the characters also goes into cast building, character relationships, and differentiation. My first con is the book was published in 2001, which means it's a little bit outdated. And I'm going to talk about that a lot more throughout. But because it was published in 2001, the breakout novels of 2000 and etc. were different, and the market was very different, and it was a different landscape. It's arguably harder now and worse. So, and readers want different things. And so I think all of the advice is legitimate, and most of it reads true to me. But it is good to keep in mind that this was published more than 20 years ago. That's so weird. Okay, pro number 2 is that this book pushes you. It's a weird thing to say. It almost feels kind of like a writing coach sometimes, but it really makes its advice hard to ignore. So we've all heard you need to have high stakes in your novel, right? And you could look at your book and be like, yeah, like they're gonna go to jail, their lives are in danger, of course it's high stakes. But he really pushes past that and gets into the components of high stakes. So he breaks it down. And he says, like, really? Are your stakes really high enough? Do you have ba, 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 ba? He gives you sort of specific techniques. So he'll say high stakes need a high human cost. You need to have the internal stakes. You need to have the public stakes. You need to have this emotional resonance. And then he says, do you have this? Do you have this? And really, like a normal craft book might say, make sure your stakes are high. This one is saying, make sure your stakes are high by doing these things. And I find it very helpful. And also the pushing part is really like, he doesn't let you get away with it. You could read a book and be like, yeah, I'm fine. Like my characters are in peril, whatever. And he's like, really? This is the best you can do? And at least that's how I hear his voice in my head. And I find that really useful because we all want to be pushed to make our books better and better. Con number 2. So this is not necessarily a con. So I found chapter 2 to 6 and 10 most useful, which means 1, 7, 8, and 9 I did not find particularly helpful. 1 was your typical why you need this book chapter that always bugs me, although it was less bad than most of the other craft book introductions because it talked about like why certain authors are flailing, their careers are failing, and how they've tried to recover from that and what they do and how they react to that. And it was really interesting because I feel like a lot of craft books address the emerging writer who wants to become published, which is where I'm working towards personally. This is interesting because it's like, so you did the thing. You can write a book that's good enough to get published, but not good enough to break out. And I thought that was a really interesting way to frame it. Chapter 7, 8, and 9, I will talk a little bit on it later, but I just didn't get too much from it, honestly. I found it talks a lot about point of view and how characters need to have a journey, etc., etc. And for some reason, it just didn't really resonate with me. The pro number 3 is there's a summary list at the end of every chapter. You gotta love a summary. It's just generally a well-structured book. So it's easy to go back and find information. I do want to go through and take better notes because I didn't take the best notes ever when I was reading it because it was really good and I wanted to get to the end. But I feel like I will go through it again. And luckily there's the summary list. There's very clear chapter like headings and such that will make finding information easy again, which is more important than you would like initially think, because Story by Robert McKee still haunts me. And I'm so glad I took extensive notes on it because without my notes, like I can never go back in that book. I don't know where to find anything. Con number 3 here is that almost none of the examples were familiar to me because this book was published in 2001. So all the books were from like 2000 and earlier, which is great, but it means that the majority of the examples were published before I was born, or at the very least, like all of them before I could read. So they weren't relevant to me, and he did include like excerpts to illustrate what he meant, which was great. But if you're looking for a conversation about the modern marketplace, that's not it. And it's not bad that they're outdated inherently. What I think is challenging is the market has changed. What readers want has changed. It evolves. It has to. And so I don't think that those books are not relevant and not good anymore, but it doesn't necessarily illustrate how to break out today, if that makes sense. And just generally, I always like books where I know the examples and I don't know the examples. So there's less power you get from the examples when you don't have context for them. All right, pro number 4. I found the premise chapter very helpful for working on the concept for my current project. I was originally going off in a direction for my book that I think would have made it really difficult to sustain conflict. There would have been too many elements. It would have been sprawling. And based on reading this book, I changed my premise. And I probably would have needed to do that anyways, but like 70,000 words later. So I'm very glad that I read this. I think even the premise itself chapter is worth it because it's hard to know. It is hard to develop a premise, and it's hard to tackle those early like StoryWorks parts of a novel. And he gives an example where he takes a pretty basic idea and he turns it into a breakout premise, and he gives you examples of questions to ask. He talks about increasing complexity, the different components to a good premise, and I think that was just a stellar stellar chapter. It was great. My fourth and final con is that the chapter 9 and a little bit kind of 7, 8, but those are, I don't know about those. Those were just kind of a broader analysis on like how point of view has evolved and why you don't necessarily need multiple points of view for a breakout novel. I didn't take very much away from them. Chapter 9 specifically is, wait for it, outdated. In my opinion, it should be read with some skepticism. It's not all irrelevant. It's not useful. But what he does, he talks about the kinds of novels that break out in different categories. He talks about sci-fi fantasy, he talks about historical fiction, and he talks about romance. For example, he says that the way romance novels break out, for a romance novel to really break out, it needs to have murder, or he said add murder, kidnapping, death, and destruction, and be sure to detail their consequences. Now that may have been true in 2000, but recently, like given romance novels like Emily Henry and Casey McQuiston, that isn't what's making romance novels break out today. Now it's like a huge big focus on rom-coms in the current market and kind of lighthearted-ish contemporaries and characters with sort of like an emotional problem that's being explored as they do the romance. Like there's all sorts of trends, but those aren't them. I can't think of a popular contemporary novel right now that has romance, that like a main romance and has murder on the side. The only one I can think of is Ali Carter's new book, Blonde Identity, which I loved, but I don't know how much noise that made in the marketplace. I think it was great. I loved that book. Anyways, the industry changes, and when you're reading this chapter, you should just keep that in mind. And my final pro is there is an accompanying workbook. It's not included with the book, but you can buy the workbook separately. And this workbook has tons of exercises. It is so concrete. And I love being concrete. Like the whole book it explains, it gives examples, and then it has the exercises. And I honestly think working through this workbook could be a pretty solid roadmap for revision. Like your revision plan is to go through the workbook. And you would do that when you have the shape of your story, but you want to go deeper, push further. It covers a lot of bases. It's extremely practical, and it's directly related to the content covered in the book and helps drive it home and reinforce it. So I also just bought the workbook, and I'm planning on working through that at some point. So overall, who is this book for? This is not a beginner's craft book. I think it will be mostly useful to you after you have your first draft, even after you've gone through a couple rounds of revision on the first draft. Given the introduction, which is all talking about mid-list authors, they know how to write a good story. They know how to write a story that is publishable. I don't think you necessarily have to have a published story for this to benefit you. I don't think you necessarily have to have even like publishable quality yet, but it is aimed more towards, this is solid, the foundation is there, my characters have arcs, like the tension is there, I know how to write a scene, my scenes are good, my scenes are well structured, my story is well structured. How do I push it further? That's the question we're really asking. So I recommend this for people in revisions, especially if you're in like that 3rd, 4th, 5th plus draft, and just trying to make it as best as you possibly can. I think this is a really great book for that. So thank you so much for watching. Let me know if you've read this book, what you thought, and if you have any other craft book recommendations or reviews you would like to see from me. I'm Nicole Wilbert. Thank you so much for watching.